Good evening, everybody. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here this evening. I'm glad we can actually have this tonight. We did have the same session was supposed to be last Wednesday, but we had to cancel it because of COVID. But it's great that we're able to be able to join here tonight to look at this very important topic. This is a topic that has been on my mind and been on my heart whenever we were thinking through some of the issues that we've been facing around the last year. We were thinking of doing something on anxiety and stress. And then someone said to me, Sam, I think it's actually anxiety and despair. And what I found is whenever we've been encouraging people to come along to this seminar, whenever you say despair, or this is a seminar on anxiety and despair, people sometimes have looked at me and went, are you kind of profiling me? Do you think that I'm desperate at the moment? And when I've actually invited people to come along, I've actually said, well, sometimes I've felt pretty desperate in these last 12 months. And there's nothing wrong with having anxiety. There's nothing wrong about having stress in our lives. And there's also nothing wrong about having despair. Because these are all emotions that we all feel in various degrees at different times and in our lives. And so I'm really glad that you can all be here this evening. I'm really happy and glad to be here and looking forward to find out and to grow in this my understanding for myself and also for others as well. It's great having everybody online as well. So for those of those who are online this evening, welcome. Just before John comes up and speaks and shares with us this evening, I've just got a telephone number this evening. So if this evening you have any particular questions that you've come along this evening to ask, or if you're at home online and you're watching it live, if you do have questions this evening, please, that's the number to call. Please don't call my number, okay? This is not my number, so if you think I'll just call Sam or just send Sam a text message, this is not my number, okay? So please don't send it to me. That's the number. Please, if you have any questions, even now if you've come this evening with questions already, during the evening if there's particular questions that you have want to ask, that's the number to send your questions to. John will come and speak, and then at the end of his time there will be a moment, there will be some times for questions. If you do want to ask questions from the floor, please feel free to do that as well. But if you prefer to do it in a quieter and more private way, then please just send the question there and we'll bring them to John afterwards. John, do you want to come up and let's give John a big welcome. You can do better than that.
Hi, does that work? No, it doesn't work. It works now.
Yes, yeah.
Terrific.
John, just before we kick off, do you just want to tell everyone a little bit about yourself? Who is John?
That's a great question, isn't it? Who are you? It's a very confrontational question, but it's a question I think we all need to come to grips with. A great way to answer that question that I think we all probably would is make a reference to my significant relationships. So who is Jono? Jono is married to Kylie. I have 4 kids at home. They're all teenagers. I come from Sydney. That's another great way to answer the question. But I've been here in Brisbane for 20 years and I work as a psychologist. I work as a clinical psychologist, which for me really means I work with mood. I work with depression and anxiety. I was once around my mother-in-law, and she said, amongst some neighbours many years ago, this is my son-in-law Jonathan. He's a cynical psychologist. And I may well be. I'll leave that for you guys to judge.
Good to have you, John. We're looking
Thank you. Okay. All right, great. Now, does that work? Yep. Terrific, it does too. Okay. All right, so everyone's got that number. We might leave those questions to the end if that's okay. But if you want to have a look at that number and text, ask a question, we'll see if we can get to as many of them as possible. We may not get to all of them, but if we could group some of them together, then we might be able to answer the majority of them. Okay. Before we get to this, what I want to do is I want to say up front, for clarity's sake, what I think would be a pretty reasonable answer to how do we cope with these experiences. These experiences are in and of themselves very distressing. And what I want to say is a pretty good way to cope with these experiences is to cope with it cognitively, is to cope with it behaviourally, is to cope with it physically, and to cope with it relationally. So I'll say that again because it's a bit of a mouthful. So what I'm going to say is a good way of coping with these things is to cope with it cognitively. And I'm going to go through all of these, so don't feel like you have to get it down immediately. But to cope with it cognitively, to cope with it behaviourally, to cope with it physically, and to cope with it relationally. And we're going to go through those, and you'll see those themes come out. First of all, what I want to start with is... just a bit of a format, a bit of a structure. So we're going to spend a little bit of time on this first one. What is our predicament? And then the second thing is, what is anxiety and what is despair? And the third thing is, how do we cope with them? And further down the track, we'll get to questions and answers. What I want to do is I want to touch base with you guys and connect with you guys, first of all. What is our predicament? If you had to think of one word that would describe for you what it's been like to be in lockdown and quarantine, what's one word that comes to mind? Isolation. It's got to be almost universal, isn't it? Isolation. Anything else? Uncertainty, big one. We just don't know. We just don't know, do we, what's going to happen next? Anyone else? Yep.
Anxiety that seems to hit consistently every day.
Wow.
Before 9:50.
Yeah. So unrelenting anxiety.
Anxiety for the daily COVID updates.
Yeah, right. Just waiting for the next update. So there's a range of things there. That is our predicament, isn't it? Isolation, anxiety, uncertainty. That is what we're living through, and it's universal, I would say. We make plans that we can't rely on, and we've got to somehow expect that your freedoms can be compromised without much notice at all. And that's the predicament that we live in. And then we have understandable measures that are restrictive, that are imposed on us for our own benefit. But unfortunately, these have their own impact. So this is a quote from a very recent study, a 2021 study. The most severe COVID-19 restrictions are associated with near double the population prevalence of moderate to severe depressive and generalised anxiety symptoms. So what this has come out of is a comparison between states. So comparing some states with other states and comparing those states that have had more recurring lockdowns and more restrictive practices with those states in Australia that have not had recurring and restrictive practices. So there's an impact of quarantine on us all. I'm not saying that it's not justified or anything like that. I'm just saying that we pay a price and it's difficult. So what does that leave us with? It leaves us with anxiety. Here's Mark Twain. He says, some of the worst things in my life never even happened. And that is a pretty good summary of anxiety. It's an over-prediction of something really bad. And this is just part of being human, I think. I don't think that everyone suffers from it in severe ways, but it's really, really common. It's a very common experience. 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men will experience significant levels of anxiety in their lives. In a period of 1 year, 2 million Australians will experience significant levels of anxiety. In the course of a lifetime, 5% will have panic attack disorders, or 5% will have it in a diagnosable way, 40% will have panic attacks, 5.7% will have health anxiety, 10% will have social phobia, 3% will have obsessive compulsive problems, 12% have post-traumatic stress, and 6% have generalised anxiety, which is like this broad brushstroke worry. It's worry about many, many different topics and difficulty controlling the worry that you get. So that one there, of course, is the one that we just spoke of that was increased. So you see this one is increasing levels of symptoms relating to depression, but also generalised anxiety, and that's that one that we see. So my experience of working here in a clinic in Brisbane is such that it's not that I have more and more people all of a sudden worried about germs. They are there, but then the proportion of my client load is not greater. It doesn't represent a greater population of people who come to see me now. It just represents more of this sort of thing, more worry in general and more depression in general. The age of onset often happens in teenage years for anxiety, but it varies a great deal. So the key things in that phrase, in Mark Twain's phrase, were about some of the worst. If you never predict something bad, you'll never get anxious about the thing that you predict. No one ever gets anxiety about predicting a good thing, but they always get anxiety about predicting a bad thing. But this thing here, the next statement is also true. It never really happened or might never happen again, right? So what he's saying is, in his head, this thing that I get anxious about, realistically, it doesn't really happen as much as I think it would happen. But that's the formula for anxiety. The formula for anxiety is this prediction that A, something bad will happen, and B, that it's really likely that it'll happen. But you can see something opening up here for anxiety, for all the anxieties. This is something that applies to every single anxiety problem. Is we predict something bad will happen, and that bad thing we think is really likely. And it's a bit like a multiplication. They go together. But if one of those things, the likelihood or the rating of how bad it is, starts to decay, then the anxiety starts to decay with it. But there's also this sense here that for whatever we predict that bad thing we think is going to happen, we also predict somehow that we won't cope. So I know a guy who used to play a lot of rugby. He was responsible for this big push and shoving match in this very important game. And I asked him one time, gosh, did you feel anxious? And he said to me he's looking down on me realistically. He said, no, not really. And I said, why is that? And then he deadpanned this response. So I don't think it was arrogance. He said, oh, I just haven't met anyone who's stronger than me, Jono. Like this. Now, I know him reasonably well, and I don't think he's being arrogant. It's just the reality for him. So you see, he has a sense of being resourced. He has a sense that he can cope. So amongst this big pushing and shoving match with all of these very strong other men, he just knows that he can cope, so he doesn't get anxious. I know me in that situation, I'd absolutely be anxious, very anxious, because I know that I wouldn't be able to cope. That's why I get anxious. So can you see the combination? There's a cognitive combination there. We predict something really bad is likely, we predict it's going to be really bad, and we also predict that we're just not going to be able to cope. But that gives us all some avenues, doesn't it? It gives us these opportunities to think through these things. Is it really true that it's going to be as bad as what I think? Is it really true that it's going to be as likely as what I think? Is it really true that I won't be able to cope the way I think I won't be able to cope? And so it brings up some great opportunities. So remember what we're talking about now, anxiety and despair. How do we cope with those things? We cope with it cognitively, and you can see that coming up now. Now we're going to move to like behaviourally and physically and relationally. This is absolutely crucial. This is something that applies in the treatment of every single anxiety condition that you can think of. Heights, spiders, panic disorder, obsessive compulsive problems, take your pick. It's always the same. And it's the same for me in my age group, and for you and you young people here, it's still the same. No matter what age group that you're in, no matter what anxiety condition we're talking about, this is always going to be the same. The more we gain exposure to the thing that we fear, the less anxious we become. And that's the way human beings work. It's the same in our culture here as it would be 2,000 kilometres, 3,000 kilometres north of here. It's the same in this culture here. Culture changes over time, doesn't it? So it's the same in this culture here as it would have been 200 years ago here, even though our culture would be different back through time. It's always the same for human beings. So part of what we do when we're treating anxiety is we're trying to find a way not only to dispute some of those thoughts. So if we go back here and we say things like, is what you fear really as likely as what you think? Is what you fear is really as bad? How do you know you won't cope? But one of the biggest things in the treatment of anxiety is working this out. How do we get more exposure to the thing that we fear? And it's funny that what actually happens is it's not just exposure, but the exposure proves a point to everyone. I'll give you this example. One time I was with someone who was very concerned about being embarrassed, concerned about, going red, right? And concerned that if this person went red in public, everyone would laugh. So what I did was I got out a red texter and I covered it on my face. And this person started laughing, right? And then I got my hand and I smudged it all over my face, right? So it didn't look like streaks of red, but it looked like smudgy red, bright red stuff. It was a whiteboard texter, right? And then we were down in Toowong at the time, and I said, so what do you think's going to happen, right, to me? And this person was still laughing at me, hurting the fragile psychologist's ego state, right? So it's really unpleasant. But then we head down to the shops, right? And this person's just expecting someone to just laugh, right? And so I said, is that what you think will happen? And the person said, yes. So we went into a shop and I said to the shopkeeper, because I just made up a product to buy as an excuse to be in the shop, can I have some chewing gum? And the shopkeeper went like this, and there was no laughter. So then I was thinking, well, this ain't good. So this is what I did. I went like this. Pointing to my smudgy red face. And honestly, this is what the shopkeeper did. The shopkeeper looked at the chewing gum and then looked up at me and went like that. So there's nothing, right? So you see what's here is it's part exposure, but it's part proving a point to yourself. It's through the exposure process that you disprove things to yourself. So you see part of the journey now for therapy, and part of the challenges that we can put out in front of ourselves that can be quite difficult, to be honest, but quite a relief when we prove something to ourselves. So you see this behaviour is linked to some of these predictions. Someone will really laugh at me. Yeah. So what I do naturally because of that belief is I lower the exposure to people. But that unfortunately maintains my anxiety because the seesaw is tipped out the other way. And so what I've got to do somehow is I've got to go around this side of the seesaw and I've got to push it up and not only desensitise myself to something, but also prove a point to myself. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay. This is what happens when we get anxious. We start exhibiting mobilising symptoms. And what I want you to do is just make a note of this, how this changes. Your mobilising symptoms work from here to here. Hold on. From here to here. So from your neck to the bottom of your rib cage. So your mobilising symptoms are those things that relate to heart rates and breathing. They're there to activate you, to fight or to flee. Yeah. So whenever we get anxious, of course, we just want to go. Yeah. It's a natural tendency, and it's predictable. There's nothing wrong with it. It's very understandable. So if you get anxious and you want to flee, Don't feel bad. That's just instinct. We all do it. I do it. Many of us do it. That's just what happens. What actually happens to these, though, is unfortunately these symptoms send a message up to your brain that says all is not good around here. It's not good. And so in panic, what happens here is so convincing, so compelling is that message that heads forth into our head. If the message becomes, I think I could die here. Because it's really convincing, it's really distressing. But you can see how what we're moving through now is this sense of there's a cognitive response that we can make to anxiety. There's a behavioural response that we can make to anxiety. But now there's a physical response that we can make to anxiety. Think now of the best way to achieve a felt sense of physical peace. Just give yourself 10 seconds to just go, what is it that works for me? Of all the activities that I've been involved with, what is it that just brings me back into my body, calms me down, and just makes me feel at peace? Now, whatever you've come up with, that's going to be a really good thing to tap into regularly. It's because your body educates you about what's up in the world. There's a book out, it's quite a famous book. It's called The Body Keeps the Score. I think it's a great title for a book because I'm not a musician. My wife she's got a really lovely singing voice. She's much more of a musician than I am. But I love that idea of the score, right? It keeps the rhythm, and your body will keep the rhythm. And your body will dictate the rhythm to you. And if your body is out of whack and is really distressed and you're using those mobilizing symptoms, then that's the score that gets created. And it can be chaotic, it can be frightening. But if you can manipulate that by doing the exercise that you just thought of, then that will change the anxiety. We're just going to make sure you get a frequent enough dose of that. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, all of these things act in a concert, unfortunately or fortunately. So what happens is the things that you think influence the action that you take, and the action that you take changes the way your body is reacting, and the way that your body reacts changes the way that you think. And all of these things create a feeling. So you can see here, it's a bit like, I always pictured this to be a bit like looking down on a tripod. And on the top of this tripod, you've got this feeling state. And it's all of this feeling state is actually held up by each of these parts of the tripod. What that then means is, if we can manipulate these ones here, then it will really shake that feeling that sits on the top. So if we have thoughts like something bad is likely, and then we want to flee, and then we get tension, we get butterflies, we get heart rate increases, we get sweaty, all of these things are supporting each other, unfortunately. It's like they're co-opting. They co-occur all the time, right? But what if we could do something about it? First of all, you might want to just make a mental note to yourself. How would you fit in those things? If you were to think of the last time you got anxious, what would you put in each of those things? And you might want to write yourself a little note if you've got something in front of you. But you might want to consider, what are the predictions that I make? Do I fight or do I flee here? What's happening in my body? Some of those symptoms. And sketch out your own formulation about your own experience. And of course, what triggers it as well. But you see, we might be able to do something about each of those factors and really unstabilise the feeling itself. And that's certainly the sense that I want to leave with you is these things are not fixed. These things are not in concrete. They get manipulated. And you can manipulate them yourself by addressing each one of these. So you might say to yourself, well, I'm not going to flee something anymore. I'm going to face it. Or I'm going to do something deliberately to manipulate those mobilising symptoms that I get. And also to test the predictions that you make. If you get really anxious, you go, I can't go there because such and such will happen, and that will be unbearable. You don't want to push yourself into something that's overbearing, but you might choose some sort of titrated version of the bad thing that you're predicting. So you might go, well, I can't go to a shopping centre. I'm not saying go out of it when quarantine is on or anything, or lockdown is on or anything like that. But sometimes after lockdown, I find that for myself and for other people that I've met, is they're just slow to get out again, which is really unfortunate. They're stuck in the habit of not connecting with people, and we're going to get to that in a few moments. And they get cautious and they get anxious, and you might want to turn that into a prediction and then test that. Maybe you don't want to go to a shopping centre because there are too many people. But you might go, I'll go to the corner store. You have a prediction that you said, I won't be able to cope. But if you go to a corner store, you might be able to test whether that prediction is true. And then you step up into something that's a bit more challenging for yourself. All right, what I want to do now, and I think this is really productive, is this. We want to follow the bad. For many, many people, you see this part of anxiety here is something bad will happen. And this is where we get a lot of, it's not, a lot of deeper issues come into play. Not all the time, but a lot of the time. So someone might have a prediction that something bad will happen, like I walk across this bridge and the bridge will collapse. Now that is not a deep psychological issue. It's just, hey, I don't want to fall 50 feet to my death. I prefer it if it didn't happen that way. Right? That seems pretty logical to me. But there are other things that are deep in the human heart that are unsettling for people. And that is what is so often linked to anxiety. So what we want to do is we're going to follow the bad, the predictions that we make about ourselves. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to link a common story into this. So first of all, I want to get to an idea of what the heart is. The heart is a beautiful ancient word that's incredibly robust. It's been around for thousands of years. You can find it in the book of Genesis. It takes 6 chapters before you see the word appear. So it's been used for thousands and thousands of years, and it's used in many, many different cultures. I don't have an exact definition that spans all cultures, but I think this is a pretty reasonable definition of what's in our heart. What's in our heart is kind of like the seat of your psychological functioning. It's kind of like deep in you. This is the space from which a lot of things come. Your thoughts come from it, your feelings come from it, your behaviour comes from it, and your physical reactions come from it. It contains connection and their consequences. So if you have really good connections with other people, your heart contains the positive consequences of that. You're much more likely to feel worthwhile. You're much more likely to feel like you can trust. You're likely to feel that you belong, and you're likely to feel honoured or honourable. But you're also likely to have a name tag that you put on yourself that's kind of constructive if you've been well connected with. So I think at a basic level, we all ask ourselves this fundamental question: who am I to be treated this way? Who am I to be treated this way? Now, if you've been treated in a really positive way, you'll answer that question, who am I to be treated this way, in quite a constructive way. You'll say, who am I to be treated this way? Well, I'm lovable, or I'm worthwhile, or I'm important. And so a whole lot of good, positive identity tags come out of that. And also you are more likely to feel hopeful. Unfortunately for a lot of us, and this is all too common, but not for all of us, a lot of us, it doesn't work that way. Unfortunately, it works the other way. So your heart contains connection and its consequences in a negative form. So if you haven't been connected with, then you're more likely to feel like you are being betrayed by someone. You're more likely to feel worthless, or you're not of much value. You're more likely to feel ashamed. You're more likely to feel alienated, like you don't belong. And on top of that, the identity tags that you give yourself will follow that as well. So someone will say, I am something, or I'm a something, I'm a failure, something like that. And they're more likely to feel hopeless or despairing as a result. This despair is what we're going to focus on now. We'll come back to some of those themes. Despair is the sense of hopelessness that you get when you sense that the bad situation just isn't going to change and you're powerless to fix it. Now, despair is something to be taken seriously. Despair and hopelessness is linked to depression, and despair and hopelessness are linked to suicidal thinking. And so what I've done is I've put that lifeline number in there. If you are suicidal, I want you to tell someone. I do not want you to keep it to yourselves. This is serious. Take it seriously. You deserve compassion and support, and your GP is well equipped to touch base with you about these things, and Lifeline is well equipped for you to talk to them about these things as well. Do not be alone. I really mean that, and I hope you take that to heart. Particularly if there's a history of suicidal thinking or suicidal actions, and moving forward, particularly if you have plans to hurt yourself. So there's this gesture in this assessment process of suicidal thinking. You've got to move back. Is there a long history of this? And you've got to move forward. Are we making plans about this? If you are doing those, if you have both of those things, then do reach out for help. Despair and hopelessness is linked to identity tags. I'm a loser, I'm a failure, and connection injuries like shame, alienation, worthlessness, and betrayal. I had this moment with my kids, my poor kids. They're the victims of of circumstance. They live with a father who's a psychologist, right? Now that's pretty tough for them, but that's just their lot. One time when they were all in primary school, I came home and I said to them, listen, you're just not pessimistic enough. And they go, what? I said, yeah. And they know I can be a stirrer from time to time. So they're a bit sceptical and they're not totally sucked into this, right? But I said to them, okay, now what you got to do, right, is if you lose a running race at school, right, if you lose, I want you to remember that you being a bad runner is permanent. It'll never change, ever, right? No matter how much you run, it'll never, ever change. Now, of course, that's just untrue, right? And some of my kids are already rolling their eyes because they know I'm pulling their leg. But I said, I haven't finished, okay? So if you lose a running race, what I want you to remember is it's not just, running that you're bad at. You're bad at lots of things, right? You've got to remember that. And then now they're really getting it. They're going, oh, gee, Dad's being silly again. And I said, now there's one more thing, all right? If you're bad at running, okay, I want you to remember, you've got to start taking it personally, okay? Don't think I'm just bad at running. I want you to think, I'm a bad person, right? And they all roll their eyes and then they, pick up their plate and say, Mum, Dad's doing it again, or something like that, right? And they walk off from the table, right? But they know I'm not serious. They absolutely know I'm not serious. And I want you to know I'm absolutely not serious. But you can see the cognitions that support despair and pessimism. These sort of ideas about things being permanent. And things aren't permanent. There's always change. Always change. But sometimes we get despairing, that's the thought that props it up. Nothing will change. But it's not true. And we need to get onto that. Don't be bullied by the despair. Don't let the despair bully your rational thinking. Yeah? But it's not just that. If you are bad at something, that does not make you a bad person. What appalling advice. What sort of dad would give that advice to their kids? Of course it doesn't make you a bad person. It just makes you bad at one thing, right? So we do these things where some of the thoughts that are associated with the despair are things are permanent and I've got to take things personally. But the last thing is that things are pervasive, right? It is simply not true that if someone is bad at running, they're bad at all things. They're just not. They're good at some things and we're bad at other things, and that's life. But you can see now if we address that as a thing as well and we don't let the despair bully our thinking, and we say to ourselves, hey, hold on a tick, that thing is not going well, I agree. But that does not mean that all areas of my life are going badly. And then already we're starting to just push around the despair instead of the despair pushing us around. One of the things that happens is behaviourally, we're talking about in anxiety, we start to want to flee, we want to run, and that's understandably. But what happens now is we start shutting down behaviourally. We want to do nothing, we want to freeze. Yeah? So now it's starting a different sort of cycle and things are changing. And you can see this in this last point here. We go into immobilizing sensations. So remember I said your mobilizing sensations are from here to here, like the bottom of your throat to the bottom of your rib cage. Heart rate's breathing. So that's what happens when you get anxious. And then when you get despairing, you start getting these symptoms here. So now you start getting appetite changes or a feeling of shame or fatigue, and the body's trying to shut down or stop. So the whole range of things happens here, but again, the same sort of thing that appears with the anxiety is that these things are opportunities. It's not set in stone. You can do something about all of these things. So of course what we want to do is we want to break down some of those thoughts about things being permanent, things being pervasive, how we're powerless, that sort of stuff. And we want to criticise some of those things. And we want to stop the freezing and we want to start doing something. Yeah, because the body's trying to, behaviourally we're trying to stop, but also we're getting these more physical sort of experiences that go with that sort of freezing response. But the interesting thing is this. Many people become anxious about what could happen, and then they become despairing when they think the bad thing they think that they feared might happen actually does happen. So this is a common pathway, right? You meet someone who's got a high degree of conscientiousness, they're at university, they're facing exams. What do so many of us do when we're heading in towards exams? We get anxious. And here is a prediction that's about to occur. Something bad could happen in this exam. And the thing that I fear, the thing that I'm predicting is giving me these mobilising symptoms. So I'm starting to get edgy and I'm starting to lose sleep. And I want to flee. I want to drop it if I could, but I can't. Now the thing that I fear, if it becomes true, then I'm likely to get despairing. So the person who feared failing an exam then becomes, and then fails the exam, they think that they've become a failure, and that's often linked to despair. Does that make sense? So you can see the link there between the anxiety and the despair, or the anxiety and the depression that so often occurs. They come from the same space. They come from a part called our heart, which gives rise to these things, gives rise to anxiety and gives rise to despair. So, what do I recommend? Well, I've got this little sort of template where what I try to do is I help people to go in to their hearts. So what I try to do is I try to encourage people to connect with themselves and recognise the impact of their hearts. For those of us who have a Christian background, I've put some verses in here as we go along that you might find as interesting reference points and quite encouraging. This thing here is about, it doesn't use these particular words, but what it's actually saying is, it gives us, there's this ancient recommendation that you should be like a curator of your heart. If you go to an art gallery, you'll see paintings on the wall, and these paintings have been cared for, but the whole building has been organised. So an art curator will care for, but also organise what's in the art gallery. And we're to do the same for what's in our hearts. What's in our heart is, remember, connection and the consequences, our identity tags and what we hope for. And that's what ultimately this verse is about where to organise and care for what is in that deep part of us. So that's what I try to do. I try to examine these things here, go into these things, and just be curious. Do I feel ashamed? Do I feel worthless? Do I feel like I've been betrayed? And go through each of these, including hopelessness and despair, and then link them up with the past. Because so often we're just creatures of our history. Like a flower, right? When I draw up a flower for people who come to see me, My second eldest child, she did a lovely drawing of of a flower, and she gave it to me for my birthday. I think it's because she saw the flowers I drew and realised they were appalling, so she drew her own one, and it's really good. And in the middle of the flower, I've written the word heart. And out of the flower, these 4 petals, what you think, what you do, what your physical state is, and what you feel. And all of these things just flow out of our heart. There's an ancient wisdom there. Why should we care for what's in our heart? Because from it flows the issues of life. From it, everything flows. And it's true, isn't it? When we're upset at a deep level, you don't need anyone to tell you to withdraw. You've already withdrawn. It's a silly suggestion. Like I do that. When I've been upset at a deep level, no one needs to tell me to think negatively. It'd be a silly suggestion. I'm already thinking negatively. It just flows out. The thoughts, the actions, the feelings, the bodily reactions. But all of those actually form maintenance loops that we have been talking about manipulating. So you think about a petal and it swings out, but we can manipulate the petal. So the thought comes out when we're really upset. I don't matter to anyone. But we can manipulate that thought. And we want to withdraw when we're feeling quite distressed. But we can manipulate that action. And it's the same with all of those 4 things. We can manipulate your body. We can manipulate some of the feelings. We can stand back from the feelings as well and not be too engrossed by them. So what I try to do with people is try to get them to connect with their hearts, get them to connect with their history. For the people who come to see me who value their spiritual walk, this is a real opportunity where I get them to go up to God and connect with their Creator. But not everyone is in a hurry to do that, and I fully understand that. But after we've done that, then we walk forward, connecting, for those people who have faith, connecting with God, but also connecting with others. So we're now getting to this final part. We're talking before about how should we deal with anxiety and despair? We should deal with it cognitively. We need to change some of those thoughts about, is it likely? Is it bad? Will I actually cope? We need to think about behaviourally. We don't want to shut down and freeze or flee. We want to face. So we've got cognitive, we've got behavioural, we've got physical, the thing that gives you physical peace, engaging with that. And we're just heading the home straight now. We're going to talk about relationships. Now, if you haven't seen this, I won't show it to you now, but there's a superb TED Talk on one of the longest running longitudinal studies ever created. It was started in I think it's 1938 or something like this. And they had hundreds of men from Harvard. It's called the Harvard Grant Study. The lead researcher, not this one, but the one before him, summed up many, many decades of research because they followed these men every single year for the rest of their lives. And what he did, he came to a 5-word conclusion, and it went like this: happiness equals love, full stop. That's it. And it's powerful stuff just for its clarity, isn't it? Happiness equals love, full stop. And it's a really powerful message. And the good news is that in this study, there are people within the study who have gone through very cold environments, family environments growing up. And they weren't happy people. But they get to middle age and they started experimenting. So there's one guy in it who started, going to the local theatre, getting involved in theatre, doing theatre, had a change of career. He started changing things in business and mixing things around. In his middle life, he was described as mediocre, kind of unappealing. Those weren't the specific words, but that's the definite flavour. But he ended his life, or towards the end of his life in his 80s, he had one of the highest levels of happiness and contentment scores. And he said with his joke, they asked him about what medication he was on. And he said, plainly, I'm only on one. And they asked him, well, what is that? And he said, Viagra. Twice a week as required. Now, I appreciate doing Viagra type activities might create a sense of connectedness, or maybe he's already feeling connectedness and that's what led him to that. But you get the point. and this is really one of the big take-home points I want you guys to absorb, is it doesn't matter about your past as long as we begin focusing on the present. Does that make sense? It doesn't matter what's in your past as long as you begin focusing on the present. What will you think? What will you do? How will you change your physical being? But also, who will you get connected with? What will you do in your relationships? Connection is so good for your body. Do you know that people who are better connected are better at fighting off viruses that we'd otherwise get, like colds and things? So better connections is linked to better immune functioning. It's better for your brain. Do you know that if you're connected, you're less likely to get dementia as you get older? Do you know it's better for your mood? You're less likely to be depressed or become depressed if you've got really good connections. But even if you do become depressed, if you're better connected, you're more likely to come out of it quicker. And it's good for your behaviour too, because if you're better connected, you're more likely to be empathic and in tune to other people, so you're more likely to show pro-social behaviour towards other people. So you see how in the middle of the flower, that is the seat of our psychological functioning, your heart, in the middle of that, all of these things just flow out if we're better connected. All right, so I'll give you a quick example, right? Jasmine is 22, so Jasmine is not her real name. I've never met a Jasmine, although Jasmine is a really lovely name. So if your name is Jasmine, that's terrific. Okay, but I've never met you. This is an actual clinical example. Okay, so she's a single lady, but she has a boyfriend, but she's been getting more anxious about her performance. So she comes from uni. She came from a family where a high level of performance was demanded of her. This little thing here, mental status, is kind of like a net that you throw over someone's functioning and you just haul it in. It's kind of a coarse-grained net. You see what comes of it. So when we did the mental status, it was fine. Her affect or her mood was a little bit slippery. It was prone to slip a little bit at times, but her judgment was episodically compromised. This happens with all of us. When we get upset about stuff, we don't think as clearly as universal experience. But otherwise, she was fine. But in her heart, she felt neglect. And she named this as I am a disappointment. So you hear the identity tag. We went back, so we spoke about when she was 7, the picture of her father with her back turned to her. And that was a literal thing, but it's also a metaphorical thing. It's that cold environment. But for her, because she had a faith, we spoke about repenting. And this is really important if you're a person of faith here. And when I use this in this context, I'm not talking about you being bad and you having to say sorry to God or other people because you're being bad. It's nothing like that. What I'm talking about there is sometimes we outsource our value and identity to the wrong person. And it's tragic. And that's what happened to this person, Jasmine. She had outsourced her value and identity to her father. And this is a grave mistake because her father was a cold person. But here, this is where it gets better. If she outsourced that to him, then she can take it back because the mistake was hers in outsourcing it to him. So now she has the power because now she realises, gosh, I didn't have to do that. That was my mistake. I'm taking it back. He doesn't get to decide my value and my identity anymore. That's it. I'm done. And that's what I mean when I write the word repentance. It's like turning her back on that whole configuration, and she doesn't want to do that anymore. And then she moves forward. She moves forward by reinvesting. You know, one of the problems here, I'm not an investor, so please excuse me. And I know I have family members, particularly my father, who would roll his eyes or be very surprised that I'm speaking to people about investments. But you'll appreciate this, right? Say if I say to you, okay, I want you to grab $20, we're going to go down to the stock market and I want you to invest in a glossy looking company that's just started up. And you go, oh, okay, well, it's a novel idea, so we do that. Guess what? The price goes up and then it crashes, right? And you go, well, thanks a lot, Jono, that was just super. And then we go home, we go, okay. Now the next day, you don't know how I achieved it, but I actually managed to convince you to take out $200,000 loan and use that. And I say, don't worry, this is a sure thing. Same procedure. We go down, the glossy new company, you buy a whole lot of shares, the shares go up, you feel kind of manic, and then by the end of the day, the shares just crash out completely. You lose all your money. People aren't so happy with Jono all of a sudden, right? But you see what's happened, it's exactly the same process, but in the first one, you cope with it. It's just like a paper cut. You get a bit annoyed, you lose 20 bucks. Oh, well, that happens. But the second one, you don't get upset. It's much more than a paper cut. But it's exactly the same dynamic. The difference is that you invested way too much in the second one, yeah? Or I cajoled you into it, right? So the problem is the level of investment that you make. If we are counting on some people to give us value and identity, that's going to be too hard. If we count on ourselves sometimes that I've got to achieve and I've got to make myself valuable and I've got to give myself a new identity, that's investing too much in us as well. And we need to be sceptical of those things. We need a lot of investments. We need to spread our investments around, not just in that person, but in that person and that person, not just in that project and not just in myself. Because the problem is we invest too much in one thing a lot of the time. And then we move forward. What do we move forward doing? So we've got this procedure with her, with Jasmine, into your heart, back, up, because that was an important part of her life, and then forward as someone who is no longer neglected with a new name. What happens now? It's like with a new identity, with someone who is not a disappointment, as someone who is valued and cared for. And we've got to make sure that there are those relationships in reality. What will you do? And you see now as something happens, because if you engage in those thoughts that go with a new identity and new value, if you engage with those behaviours, then good things are going to come. Thoughts and behaviours, because those things feed back on ourselves. So this is what I set up for people. This was for Jasmine. You can see these little things here that we got, the feeling and the thoughts and the behaviours that go with it. And particularly engaging with what's in their heart. And I try and organise. It's a bit of social engineering to a degree. Because faith was important to Jasmine, she liked to engage in her own spirituality. So we made sure we bolstered that by engaging her in activities that brought her closer spiritually to things. But we also started talking about who are the people, who are the family and friends who really she's just on the same wavelength with. She has a rapport with. She can laugh with, things like that. How often are you seeing those people? So many of us are just underdosing on good relationships, and we need to dose up on those. But also for Jasmine, of course, it was church and church ministries that she was giving to, but also professionals, people who know what they're doing with anxiety and despair, and people who can support her. So in that case, it was me. So there's this overall theme here of, you see, facing me and others. So she faces herself, that's the me there. So she connects with herself, but she also connects with others. And that's the pattern. It's kind of like the scaffolding that you put around an older building that's in decay. And you put that scaffolding around a building that's in decay, and you know you're getting ready to be rejuvenated. All right, so that's what we've got. We've got how do you deal with anxiety and despair? You deal with it cognitively. You deal with it behaviourally, you deal with it physically, and you deal with it relationally. I want to thank you for your time here today. Of course, I'm very open to taking questions. But feel free to walk around if you need to, or stretch your legs now, because I know you've been sitting and paying attention for quite some time, so thank you. Any questions that we might have? One of the things, just while we're getting this organised, one of the things is facing your friends and spending time with your friends is really important, but having fun with your friends is really important. Sharing a sense of humour is really important. Do you know, I heard this story, it was told to me, so please excuse me if you know this story, but there were two Australian guys and they go overseas and they're in the Navy. It's the first time in the UK, and they rush to their hotel, they dump their bags at a hotel and they go to an English pub because they've never been to an English pub before. And they settle in for the evening, and they're a little put off by warm beer, but nonetheless, because they've been drinking cold beer ever since they were 17 and a half, 18, and they settle in for the evening, and then they're a bit under the influence, and then they stumble out 4 or 5 hours later, and it's dark. And a thick English fog has just rolled through this place. And they're a little bit affected, and they're a little bit disorientated, and they're in a completely new town, but they've got to make their way back to the hotel, so they stumble out into this soup, this pea soup of a fog. And they've been walking around for like 20 minutes, and they look up to this hill, and it's this backlit, shadowy figure emerges, right? And descends on them like this. And they're so relieved to see someone, anyone. They rush up to this guy, and they get closer to him, and they realise he's this tall, refined Englishman. Right? And they're being Australian, they're so familiar, so awkwardly familiar. They think everyone's on the same level wherever they go, and they think there's no one less than them, there's no one worse than them. So they just rush up to this guy and they say, "Hey mate, do you know where we are?" Like this. And this man, this tall, refined man who ended up being an English sea captain, was just shocked. Right? And he thought, goodness, I've got to rectify this situation. I'm above them, they are beneath me. They're obviously just juniors, I'm a sea captain. No one rushes up to me and just says, "Hey mate." So he looks down his nose at them and he says, "Do you know who I am?" Like this. And one Australian looks up at this guy, and then he looks at his friend and he goes, "Well, this is terrific, isn't it? We're completely lost, and we're with some guy who has no idea who he is." We're not just spend time with your friends. We've got these answers tonight: cognitive, behavioural, physical, but relational is an absolutely key thing. Have fun with your friends. Ring them up. Get on the internet. Share a joke. Laugh with each other. Have fun with each other. And when quarantine lifts, head straight back out into those relationships. All right. Do we have any questions at all?
Yes, Donna, we do. Yep, we've got a couple coming through here. So there's a question here. For someone who faces health anxiety,
Yep.
how would you get exposure for anxiety, for example, like having a heart attack?
Yeah. What a great question, and a very common experience. This isn't unusual at all. There's a range of things that I would consider. One is what happens at the core of this problem is being spooked by a commonly occurring symptom. So for many of us who get this, we feel or sense commonly occurring symptoms, and we misinterpret them as being significant. So what will happen is you'll get a heart rate change or a fluctuation. And if you've been to the doctor and the doctor, GP, is not worried about you, then what happens is someone like that comes to me, and then we talk about how they interpret those symptoms. That's the first thing, is the misinterpretation of them. So what happens then is people will misinterpret it, and because they've misinterpreted it and they're convinced this means I could die, then they start freaking out. And of course now we start a new roll-on of physical symptoms, which are naturally distressing and which makes it even more convincing that something bad is about to happen. So then what happens next is people will check. This is an exercise I can do for you. If you've got a pen, not all of you will have a pen, but if you have a pen, this is what I want you to do. Put a dot on the back of your hand. So if you have a pen, put a dot on the back of your hand. Congratulations, you now have an itchy bite. When you get an itchy bite, what do? Scratch it. When you scratch it, what happens to it? Sorry? It grows. Okay, now it's bigger. If you've still got a pen, make your itchy bite even bigger now. Okay, so now you've got an itchy bite. What do? What? You'd still scratch it? Okay, so, and then when you scratch it, what happens to it? Now it grows bigger. Okay, so now you've got an itchy bite. Okay, what do? Scratch it again. So, what? Someone's...
You ring up your GP at Elisa and ask for ask for some treatment antibiotics to handle the
You're right. I won't give names or phone numbers of GPs, but yes. Sometimes we then go to check. There was some other. Well, someone else said something. What do you do? Cut off your hand. You what? Cut off your hand? Yes. Oh, finally, relief. I've cut off my hand. Anyone else?
You scratch it again.
You scratch again. What happens to it? Now it's even bigger. Okay, now we've got 4 itchy levels. You've got an itchy bite. What do?
You take some of these.
You take something else. You try something different. Why?
Because if you're scratching it that much, it's probably got an infected.
If you're scratching that much, it's probably infected. What was the other one?
Because your original plan is not working.
The original plan is not working. Okay. So here's the question with this sort of stuff. If you have health anxiety, what is your itch? It's a spontaneous thing that just arrives. What is the itch? Yeah. Is this sense I'm in danger, right? What's the scratch? What could be a whole... Sorry? Symptoms. The scratch is the thing that you do that you think is going to rescue you from the problem. It's the thing that you do to reduce the distress.
That could be a COVID-19 vaccination.
It could be. Well, the scratch, if you got repeated ones, like 7 or 8 in a row, then you might be scratching like that. But you see what we're doing is people might use their GP, or they might get reassurance. Repeated visits to the GP, or checking with a partner, am I okay? Am I not okay? Or they might do mental checks, or they research with Dr. Google, which is a disaster, okay? Because Dr. Google ought to be investigated for over-diagnosing, right? So all of those things, of course, you see the cognition, which is misinterpretation of commonly occurring symptoms, and then checking. And the checking, there's a small dip in the anxiety, but then the anxiety rises. Does that make sense? And so the treatment for health anxiety revolves mainly around those 2 things. Learning to not misinterpret, but also learning not to check, not to scratch the itch.
John, there's another question here that's asking, during this time of COVID, I have lost the appetite to enjoy life.
Yeah.
How do I get that appetite back again?
What a great question. So the question was, during quarantine, I've lost the appetite for life. How do I get it back? Yeah. Does everyone get a sense that that's kind of what we're all experiencing? Yeah. It's so common, isn't it? This zeal for life. I think it's called there is a rise in depression symptoms, but for the most part, it's just like a flatness that we all get. It's a symptom of anhedonia, which is like no pleasure, right? We just spend way too much time indoors. The first thing that's got to happen is go into your heart and go into, all of those domains that we shared, like your cognitions, your behaviours, your physical state, and what's in your heart, and just examine all of those. And when you examine all of those, that's going to give you some really good leads. The most obvious thing that's come out of tonight, and I hope this is true for you guys as is for me, is when you get the opportunity to relate, make sure you do. Ring up a good friend. When everything lifts and we're free to go out again, which will happen. I don't know if it's going to happen immediately, but it will happen. Give them a call, make a date, go out and have fun, and make that the goal. I'm going to have fun with you. And you just tell them. You say, you're on the phone, you say, hey, do you want to meet up on Saturday? And they'll probably be a bit flat, just like you. They go, oh, yeah, okay, that sounds right. That sounds nice. And you tell them, you say, you want to know why? You don't want to know the reason why? They go, why? To have fun. Why else? Okay? And make that your agenda, fun with friends, because that connectedness is incredibly powerful.
Another question here, John. Could you just repeat the question?
Yeah, sure.
Because that's the microphone for the live feed.
Yep.
What are the strangest physical symptoms of anxiety you've seen, and how do you overcome severe symptoms that incapacitate you and don't give up? strangest physical symptoms of anxiety that you've
Right.
seen.
So what's the strangest
And
physical
common
symptom of
severe
anxiety?
symptoms. Yeah. Can you just repeat that?
Yeah. So the first question was, what is the more unusual physical symptoms of anxiety? So one time lately, there was someone who came to see me, and I don't want to ever be specific, but someone came to see me, and they were really concerned that a particular symptom would lead them to just die. They were just going to die. And so what this person would do is this person would make sure that that symptom was never occurring, right? So, and it was a bit like that old movie Speed, like with Keanu Reeves. If you're nodding, you're approaching my age. I'm sorry to hear that or see that. But if you have no idea what I'm talking about, you're still quite youthful, but it's still a good movie. But the plot there is the bus can't slow down. No matter what, if the bus slows down, the bomb goes off. So it's a disaster. And this person had that in that sort of mentality. They can't stop, because if they stop, then they'll just collapse and die. And now this, I say this, right, but I want you to know something occurred before this. This person had been comprehensively assessed by a physician multiple times, but they're still really anxious. So I need to say that specifically. There's been a team of very professional people who examined her and said, no, it's about anxiety. So when this person came to see me and they said, well, I'm concerned that if I stop, I'll die, I said, well, why don't we find out? And this person looked appalled and went white. And they said, what are you talking about? I said, well, apparently I'm a health professional. Let's just see what happens. Why don't you just stop completely and we'll see if you die. And if you die, I'm sorry about that. But if something really bad happens, I will call someone immediately. I'm all on top of this. Don't you worry. And completely shocked. Now remember, what I'm saying is that this isn't reckless. She'd been examined comprehensively by a medical professional before me. And of course what happens is she's just then looking the anxiety straight in the face. Yeah, it's really courageous stuff, and I fully respect this person for it, because the very thing that she wanted to avoid is the very thing that she fronted up to and just stared at it right in the face. And then you see the exposure seesaw, remember that? And then she proved a point to herself, and she's profoundly relieved. Yeah, she was profoundly relieved that she didn't die. So that's the first one. What's the more unusual one in terms of anxiety symptoms?
Yep. And how do you overcome those severe symptoms that incapacitate you and don't heal up?
I guess one of the things there, the first thing that comes to mind is like a ladder. We overcome anxiety with like a few sort of simple rules, I think. They're simple, but they're hard, okay? Hard in terms of, it takes a lot of courage. They've got to be, the things that you expose yourself to have got to be graduated. So you start at the bottom of a ladder and you move up a ladder, up a rung each time. And the top of the ladder represents, really difficult things to confront. So you've got to work out a ladder of exposure. So the things to expose yourself to has got to be graduated, it's got to be repeated, and it's got to be prolonged. So you pick things that spook you, but you work at the bottom level of things that are achievable, and you expose yourself to it. You use the seesaw. That's the progress. That's the name of the game. Yeah. Graduated, repeated, prolonged. So you can't expose yourself to something like, if you expose yourself to a height, right, and you just take one step out onto a bridge that's like 100 metres long and you go, yeah, okay, I'm done. Like there's no way that you're going to feel the benefit of the exposure. You've got to take a step out, and that's just one step towards the exposure. But it's got to be prolonged enough for you to get a sense that your anxiety is now dipping back down again. And then you can take a step back if you had to.
Okay, you don't know. I think the cognitive factors are highly linked to a previous trauma. How can we deal better with trauma to stop it in its tracks before it expresses out in a panic attack or anxiety? Are there practical things that we can do, especially when we're not able to think rationally?
Yeah, I'm so glad for this question. Thank you very much.
Can you just repeat the question again?
Yeah. So the cognitive things that I spoke of can be linked to trauma, and that is absolutely true, and I'm really grateful for the question. And so the question then is, if it is linked to previous experiences, what do we do about it? Well, you see in this one with Jasmine, what we did is we actually did go back. We went back to previous experiences. This is like a soft trauma, so she didn't have flashbacks because of this particular incident, but a lot of people do, and that's what we got to give ourselves exposure to. So it's the same sort of method, like post-traumatic stress is the same sort of anxiety-related sort of condition, and it has the same quest involved in it, which is how do I, as a clinician or with the patient together, how do we get more and more exposure to it? Because when we get more exposure to it, then the anxiety comes down about it. There's an interesting, there's some interesting things with trauma that we also need to do that a psychologist would take you through if you've been through a traumatic event. One of them is about the nature of the memory itself. If you ask someone, a normally constructed memory requires effort that you put into it, and it's very rich in context. So if I said to you now, what is it that you had for breakfast? What you probably do is what most people do when I ask them that question is they go like this, they go, and they look away from me. And the reason why they look away is they want to disengage me, and so they can go in, and they put effort into going in. And that's the first difference with a trauma memory, is people don't have to put effort to go in to get a trauma memory. It just happens, just like that. Then the second thing is that when I ask you about breakfast and what you have, you're more likely to give me quite a rich context. So you're more likely to say, after you put effort in, and it won't come quickly, and that's one of the differences with a trauma memory. It does come very quickly, but you put effort in, you go, oh, what did I have? What did I have? And then you go, oh no, that's right, I just had a coffee. But that's right, I was at my computer, and this is a real story, I was at my computer and I was refraining from tearing my hair out because I entered a new password for the computer at the front desk, and the computer was telling me you'd forgotten your password and I couldn't open my own computer. So that's what I was doing this morning. So a very rich context, right? I'm a neo-Luddite, I think. Anyway, so that's what I was doing. So now I've got, you see, in a normal memory, I've got a very rich context, but trauma memories have a really bad context. One of the key things that they're missing is a time code. They don't have time codes. So a lot of what we try to do with trauma memories is, of course, get exposure to them, but we're also going to try and transform these memories into a normal memory. And the way you do that is by updating it. I'm 22. I'm not 8. I'm actually not even close to 22. I was deeply flattering myself, right? But that's the sort of thing that you say to yourself, right? So you're having this re-experiencing or something, and you say to yourself, hold on, this is 2021. This isn't 2011. And, you know, I'm big. I'm not little. And I'm safe. I'm not unsafe. And so these things that are sort of updating the memory and changing the memories itself. Yeah.
There's a question here. Johnny, you've mentioned faith a couple of times in your talk. What difference does faith make to this issue of anxiety and despair?
Faith for many people, not just me, makes a very significant difference. In this, here's a gratuitous moment of self-promotion. Oh, what? Who put that there? Oh my goodness. This reconnected heart is all about a three-way relationship. It's about the power of connectedness, that if we have a lot of it in our lives, it really makes a big impact on us at a deep level. And a key part of that, because it's a three-way connection, it's a connection with yourself, but it's a connection with other people, and it's a connection with God. Why is that spoken about in this book? Well, because many of the people come to see me, it's important to them, and they benefit from it. There is a long history of in the tradition of faith, Christian faith, where they recognise that suffering is really real, and we don't skirt over it, and nor should we. But there's a relationship that we have with a Creator that gives a lot of people a lot of hope. I'm not saying there that, you know, somehow if you turn up to church, all your depression and anxiety is gone. It's just untrue and unhelpful. It's just not the case. Nonetheless, it is a pretty reasonable, moderately positive, impactful thing for many, many people who find it to be a great resource. And it has been in my life, and it's in the life of many people who come to see me too.
So, John, where can we get that book that you were waving around?
Oh, gee. I think it's on Amazon. Yes, it's on Amazon. Do you know the funny thing? I was walking down the street. There's this photo of me, right? I was walking down the street and I was speaking and I ran into a neighbour, Annette. She was gardening out the front. And so she's sticking a trowel in the ground and she goes, "Jono?" I said, "Yes, Annette." And I'm walking our dog, the greyhound, right? So the greyhound's really interested. The greyhound loves Annette. And she said, "Jono?" I said, "Yes, Annette." She goes, "Did you write a book?" I said, "Yes, Annette." And then she said, "What did you use that photo for?" So she's not happy with the photo. But you can find it on Amazon. It's done by Westbow Press. Yep.
Okay. Just another question here, John. When dealing with an anxiety attack or PTSD, how can we approach people in order to allow them to be there for you or let them know?
So, like, how do we as caregivers respond to people going through those horrible anxiety moments?
So then it goes on here. I sometimes feel like I want to tell people about my anxiety, but I don't know how to approach it.
Oh, so is this talking from a caregiver's perspective? It's like, what do I do for the person who's in distress?
When dealing with an anxiety attack or PTSD,
Yeah.
how can we approach people in order to allow them to be there for you or to let them know? If sometimes I feel like I want to tell people about my anxiety,
Oh, right, all
but I
right.
don't know how to approach
All right, how do I tell people about my anxiety? I think the first thing is strike while the iron is cold. It's just so distressing to the point of being terrifying. Reliving because of previous trauma or a panic attack is extremely distressing, and you aren't going to think straight and you aren't going to talk straight, and it's not going to be sensible. So choose a time, if you are really distressed, to talk to someone about it. That's the first thing. And just explain some of those symptoms and some of those experiences that we're just talking. What sort of thoughts do you get? How does your body react? What sort of behaviours do you get? And at a deep level, what are you concerned about most? When you do that, most people will just show genuine compassion, and that's exactly what you need. You need to be surrounded by people who are compassionate.
Okay. Sorry, John, you've been great. Thank you.
That's
for
all right,
answering
not at all.
those questions.
Maybe last one, because I'm keen for people to stretch their legs if they need to.
What if you have the opposite problem, that lockdown calms and comforts you? Also, how big is the difference between suicidal inclination and ideation?
Right. So the first one is, what if you're enjoying quarantine and lockdown?
Lockdown, yeah.
Well, that's super. Well, at least someone's happy. That's the first thing. Unfortunately, I would be concerned about what happens next. People do enjoy it, and some people have reported feeling more settled, but at some point quarantine will lift. And we can see there that avoidances often soothe us in the short term, but in the medium term and the long term, they definitely don't. I guess what should they do if they're being soothed by lockdown? Well, is prepare themselves psychologically to get out. Yeah, in short steps, not in mammoth steps, but in short steps. And the second thing is to do with ideation and inclination, isn't it?
What's the difference?
Yeah, I think there is quite a big difference. And you'd see, I would put inclination in the sense of the degree to which you are moved out towards behaviour and means. So some people will have ideation and they'll think about suicide. It'll just be a passing thought. And there's nothing particularly compelling about it. And they have no history and they have no plans. So you move backwards and you move forwards. Then if the inclination is there, it moves out of their heart, I think, into plans, so it moves into their cognition, and then it starts moving into their behaviour, starts moving into means, and they start getting things together. And of course, the more you move out towards those sectors, the more concerned you should be about yourself, and absolutely the more you should be reaching out and talking to someone about it. I want to make that really clear. Do not be alone. There are many people who will love you and many professional people who will care for you If you have that experience, do reach out to your GP or call Lifeline, because there's no need to be alone, particularly if you've got those inclinations moving out into plans, moving out into means. Yeah.
I just want to go, are there any questions from the floor at all that anybody might have? I know that some people have been sending texts from their phone, but is anybody, anything, you couldn't be bothered typing something with your phone?
Jono, have you
Yeah.
had all your COVID vaccinations yet?
I've got one more tomorrow. I've got an AstraZeneca tomorrow at 2 o'clock. I went in there with my wife, Kylie, and she was over the moon because we went in there and this young nurse said, as a man, he said, "You don't look old enough to be 50. And Kylie was going, she was on top of the world for the rest of the day. So I'll be having my second one tomorrow.
Thank you for that, Jono.
Rebecca?
As someone like feeling stuck in despair and stuff,
Sorry, as someone who...
feeling stuck in despair,
Yep,
I feel comfortable and would like to just sleep all the time,
right,
and I've pretty much slept all day today.
right.
How do you get yourself to do something when, like, my eyes are just tired all the time?
Wow. I mean, that is tough, isn't it?
Like, I don't know how to get myself to do anything.
Yeah, that is really tough. So there are two things there. One, being stuck in the despair, and two is your energy is down. And you see that fits before with what we're talking about, the immobilizing symptoms, these sort of physical experiences, dropping of fatigue and sleep, increasing fatigue and sleeping more and feeling stuck. I think the key thing is you just move back with some of those things. The main thing is with despair, we don't want to be flippant about it. So start organising people around you. We put up a pyramid there. If spirituality is important to you, then there's a good opportunity to engage yourself spiritually. But also professional people, which is going to be key when you're despairing, but also friends. And then it's just about making very small plans. That's all. It's about like that rung, that's bottom rung of the ladder. What things can I do to move? What things can I do to change? But particularly, I think, support and care. Does that sound okay? Does that sound helpful?
Yeah, I just don't know how to do that.
Yeah. Well, the best thing to do is your GP. Your GPs are really well-trained people. Just have those conversations and start building people around you that in small ways, people who can connect you and love you, I think, but also give wisdom, speak wisdom into your situation, because that sounds tough to me. I'm sorry to hear that.
So I'm just wondering, because you can get like mental health care plans from
Yeah.
GP to
Yeah.
get the 20, it's not, psychology sessions. And
Yeah.
if you have like different diagnoses, you can get more or less and stuff like
Yep.
that. But there is also like that 3-month waiting list to see
Yeah.
for a psychologist.
Yeah.
What would you recommend during that 3-month process?
Yeah, great
Or,
question.
If you're being proactive about something.
Yeah, great question. So the question for everyone, if they didn't hear it, was there are supports available and you can get referrals to a psychologist, but often there's a waiting list to see a psychologist that takes months and months, and that's unfortunately realistic. I've got a large waiting list, but it's no big reflection on me. There are many of my colleagues have large waiting lists as well. So what would we recommend what would I recommend as in that interim period? I think that as a question is something that we have to face as a community, because what you're describing, having to wait for support, it's not ideal at all. And we as a community need to come up with many suggestions. This event I see as one very small part of kind of like a community response to this, because people are waiting a lot. And you can see here where there are things to start, and I hope you feel like you've got a few little ideas to start with. In the meantime, is that pyramid, of course we can't put a professional down the bottom corner of the pyramid, but we can put friends on there. And we can put family on there, and you can put Lifeline on there as well. Does that make sense? Yeah.
I wasn't asking for me. 'Cause
No, right, for people in general.
Just in general.
Thank you.
I
Absolutely.
work in the healthcare industry and I see a lot of people stuck in that
Yep.
waiting list process.
Thank you, yes.
And they don't really know.
Great. Yeah, so asking on behalf of other people. Yeah, really good, and I'm really glad you raised that question because it's a reality, and we as a community, we have to come up with different solutions to it. But yeah, I think it is about, it's a lot about connectedness, I think, and who are the people that we can put around us at the base of the pyramid who we can connect with.
Okay, John, I think we'll leave it there. Thank you so much. You worked really hard this evening, so I want to say thank you on behalf of everybody here, everybody watching at home as well. I want to say thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
As John has mentioned, we hope this is really the first of many conversations about this, and I'm sure that as we come through COVID, as we start moving out of lockdown and moving out of the COVID world, the impact that it's had on us, I hope that as a community that we can continue to support one another. And I want to encourage anyone who's here this evening who is struggling with anxiety, struggling with despair, please speak to someone. There are people here this evening that you can talk to. Please, if you don't have someone to come to, please come and speak with me, and we can, or speak with John, or we can put you in contact with someone to talk to as well. If you are really struggling, I really encourage you, please speak to someone, and as John was sharing, look at those different ways in which you can connect with others. So thank you so much for being here. Please stay safe. Please feel free to hang around and spend, I know that Yoriko's been in the kitchen cooking dinner for us this evening. She's got some takeaways for people to take home as well, so please feel free to grab some of those as well. But please feel free to linger and keep chatting and encouraging one another. But thank you. Please stay safe and safe home. God bless.
Good. I've got to put this back.